Sometimes the hardest choice we ever make is opening the door when everything inside us says to walk away. Sometimes one moment of mercy changes everything we thought we knew about ourselves. High in Montana's Bitterroot Range, Greta Lorne has lived alone for 20 years, asking nothing from anyone. But on a bitter February night, she finds a dying man collapsed in the snow outside her cabin. His name is Reeve Calder, and he's running from something darker than the storm. Saving him should have been simple. Warm him up, send him on his way. But nothing about Reeve Calder is simple. And when his past comes looking for him with loaded guns and old debts, Greta's quiet mountain becomes the center of a firestorm that will force an entire valley to reckon with secrets buried long ago. What happens when doing the right thing costs you everything? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The wind came down from the high country like something with teeth, scraping across the ridgeline and howling through the pines that surrounded Greta Lorne's cabin. She stood at her kitchen window, hands wrapped around a chipped ceramic mug of coffee gone cold, watching the sky darken to the color of old bruises. February in the Bitterroot Range was unforgiving, and this storm had been building for 2 days. The weather service down in the valley had been calling it the worst blizzard in a decade, but Greta had lived through worse. She'd lived through things that made a Montana winter seem kind by comparison. At 58, Greta carried herself with the careful economy of someone who'd learned to waste nothing. Not movement, not words, not heat. Her face was weathered like driftwood, lined by sun and wind and the passing of years. She'd stopped counting somewhere around 45. Her hair, mostly grey now with stubborn threads of the brown it used to be, she kept tied back in a practical braid that fell between her shoulder blades. Her hands were scarred and capable, the hands of someone who'd built her own life board by board, stone by stone, choice by choice. The cabin itself reflected that same practical solitude. One room served as kitchen, living area, and workspace, with a wood stove radiating heat from its corner like a beating heart. The bedroom was small, just big enough for the iron frame bed that had been here when she'd bought the place 20 years ago. Everything was clean, orderly, minimal. No photographs on the walls, no clutter on the surfaces, just the necessities, and one exception. Samuel's pocket watch on the mantel above the stove. Stopped permanently at 3:47. She set down the mug and moved to the stove, feeding it another split log from the stack she'd brought in that morning. The routine of survival up here had become second nature. Check the wood supply, check the water, check the traps, check the sky. Repeat until spring, then repeat until winter. 20 years of the same careful patterns, and they'd kept her alive, kept her functioning, kept her from having to think too much about the fact that she was merely existing rather than living. Outside, the first flakes began to fall. Thick and heavy, the kind that meant business. Greta pulled on her work coat, canvas patched at the elbows, smelling of wood smoke and pine sap, and stepped out onto the porch. The cold hit her face like a slap, stealing her breath for just a moment before her lungs adjusted. She'd need to bring in more wood before the storm really settled in. Maybe check the shed to make sure everything was secure. The wind was already picking up, and by nightfall, the visibility would be down to nothing. She worked steadily for the next hour, hauling split logs from the woodpile to the covered porch, stacking them within easy reach of the door. Her breath came out in white clouds, and her fingers ached even inside her work gloves, but she didn't slow down. This was mountain living. Anticipate, prepare, survive. There was no calling for help up here, no neighbor to knock on the door if something went wrong. The nearest occupied cabin was 10 miles down a trail that would be impassable by morning. That was exactly how she wanted it. By the time she finished and stepped back inside, the storm had arrived in earnest. Snow fell so thick she could barely see the tree line 50 yards from the cabin. The wind screamed around the corners of the building, testing every board, every nail, looking for weakness. Greta stripped off her coat and boots, hung them by the door, and returned to the stove. She'd make soup tonight. Venison from the deer she'd taken in November, root vegetables from the cellar, herbs she'd dried last summer. Simple food, but it would last her 3 days if she was careful. As the soup simmered, she allowed herself the luxury of sitting down, easing into the wooden chair by the window with a book she'd read twice before. The light outside was dying fast, swallowed by snow and clouds, but she didn't light the lamp yet. Fuel was finite, and she'd learned long ago to ration everything, including the small comforts. Her mind drifted, as it often did in the quiet moments, to Samuel. 20 years since the avalanche had taken him, and she could still see his face as clearly as if he'd walked through the door that morning. Samuel Lorne, patient and steady, who taught her everything about surviving in these mountains. He'd been a guide, one of the best, and she'd been his student, then his partner, then his wife. They'd built this life together, or rather, he'd built it, and she'd learned to live in it, until the day he'd gone out with a group of tourists from California, leading them up to the glacier overlook, and the snow had come loose above them. 5 people died that day. Samuel was one of them. Greta had been down in the valley, buying supplies, arguing with the clerk at the general store about the price of coffee. She'd been angry with Samuel that morning, angry about something so trivial she couldn't even remember what it was now. They'd fought before he left, her last words to him sharp and cutting, and he'd never come home to hear her apologize. She'd tried to forgive herself. 20 years of trying. It hadn't worked yet. The watch on the mantel had stopped at the moment of his death. She'd learned that later from one of the rescue workers who'd recovered his body. She'd wound it once, the day of his funeral, and it had run for exactly 12 hours before stopping again at 3:47. She'd taken it as a sign, though she didn't believe in signs. Some things just were. Some moments didn't get to pass. Some clocks stayed stopped. After Samuel died, people had expected her to leave the mountains, to sell the cabin and move down to the valley where life was easier, safer, less lonely. But Greta had stayed. Not out of strength or determination, but out of guilt. This place had killed her husband, and she'd convinced herself that she owed it something, her presence, her solitude, her slow fade into the landscape. She'd taken over his guiding business at first, leading groups up the familiar trails, teaching them the things Samuel had taught her. But after 2 years, she'd stopped taking clients. The responsibility for other people's lives had become too much. What if she missed something? What if someone died because she wasn't paying attention, wasn't good enough, wasn't Samuel? So she'd retreated further into isolation, taking odd jobs when she needed money, consulting for the forestry service, checking trails for the park rangers, tracking wildlife populations. Work she could do alone. Work that didn't require her to trust anyone or ask anyone to trust her. The valley below had mostly left her alone after that. Virgil Hess, who ran the general store, still treated her kindly when she came down once a month for supplies. Sheriff Tom Bridger, who'd been Samuel's closest friend, still checked on her when he could, though she made it clear she didn't need checking on. And Pauline DeWitt, the valley's unofficial keeper of everyone's business, still asked after her with genuine concern. Even when Greta gave her nothing in return, they called her the hermit woman, the widow who'd gone strange after her husband died. Greta didn't mind. Better to be thought strange than to let people close enough to see how broken she actually was. The soup finished cooking, and she ladled some into a bowl, eating slowly by the window as the storm raged outside. The wind had taken on a different quality now, a keening howl that made the cabin walls shudder. She'd weathered storms like this before, dozens of them, and the cabin had always held. Samuel had built it to last, anchored deep into the mountain's stone bones. It would outlast her probably, outlast her and stand empty, a monument to a life half-lived. She washed her bowl and spoon, banked the fire in the stove, and prepared for bed. It was barely 7 o'clock, but there was no point staying awake. Tomorrow would be a day of digging out, assessing damage, making sure the shed hadn't lost its roof. The rhythms of survival didn't care about comfort or preference, but as she moved toward the bedroom, something made her pause. A sound, barely audible under the wind's roar. She stood still, listening, her body tensing with an instinct she'd thought she'd lost years ago. There it was again, a scraping sound, irregular, almost like something dragging across wood, probably just a branch blown against the cabin wall, or an animal seeking shelter from the storm. Nothing that required investigation in weather like this. She took another step toward the bedroom, but the sound came again, and this time it was accompanied by something else. A thump, heavy, deliberate. Greta's heart rate picked up. In 20 years of living alone on this mountain, she'd never had trouble. This occasional black bear investigating the shed, yes. Elk wandering too close to the cabin, certainly. But nothing human, nothing deliberate. She moved to the window, pressing her face close to the cold glass, trying to see through the snow. Nothing but white. The porch light would draw attention she might not want, but not knowing was worse. She flipped the switch, and yellow light spilled out onto the snow. At first, she saw nothing. Then movement. A dark shape at the edge of the porch slumped against the railing. Too big to be an animal. Too still to be alive. For a long moment, Greta stood frozen, every instinct screaming at her to stay inside, to lock the door, to pretend she'd seen nothing. She'd spent 20 years avoiding exactly this kind of moment, the moment when someone else's survival became her responsibility, the moment when she had to choose between safety and compassion. The shape didn't move. Snow was already beginning to bury it, accumulating in the folds of what looked like a coat, drifting against what might have been legs. She thought of Samuel's watch, stopped at 3:47. She thought of the last 20 years, locked in her own private winter, frozen at the moment she'd lost the only person she'd let herself love. She thought of all the ways she'd chosen safety over everything else, chosen isolation over risk, chosen survival over living, and then, before she could talk herself out of it, Greta Lorne pulled on her boots, grabbed her coat, and opened the door to the storm. The wind nearly knocked her back inside, but she pushed forward, snow stinging her face, her breath stolen by the cold. The shape on her porch resolved into a man, older, maybe 60, maybe more, face down in the snow, not moving. She dropped to her knees beside him, pulling off her glove to press 2 fingers against his neck. His skin was ice, but underneath it, faint and irregular, she felt a pulse. He was alive, barely. Greta didn't let herself think. Thinking would mean stopping, and stopping would mean he died. She got her arms under his shoulders and started dragging him toward the door. He was heavy, dead weight, and her back screamed in protest, but she didn't stop. 1 foot, then another, until she had him over the threshold and inside where the warmth from the stove could reach him. She kicked the door shut behind them and knelt beside him again, this time in better light. He was older than she'd first thought, his face weathered and lean, with grey stubble covering his jaw. His clothes were soaked through, frozen in places, and his lips had a blue tinge that spoke of severe hypothermia. Rope burns marked his wrists, visible where his coat sleeves had ridden up. Recent bruising darkened his cheekbone and jaw. This man hadn't just gotten lost in the storm. Someone had hurt him. Someone had left him to die, and Greta had just made him her problem. She stripped off his frozen coat and started working on his boots, her hands moving with the efficient care of someone who'd dealt with frostbite before. Get him warm, get him dry, get fluids into him if he woke up. The medical protocol ran through her mind automatically, lessons Samuel had drilled into her during their first winter together. As she worked, she noticed things. A leather saddlebag half frozen to his side, a revolver tucked into his belt. And when she pulled off his shirt, she saw more bruises, more evidence of violence. This wasn't some tourist who'd gotten turned around in the storm. This was someone running from something, someone dangerous maybe, or someone in danger. Either way, he was in her cabin now, and the storm had made the decision for both of them. There would be no getting him down the mountain tonight, no calling for help. No sheriff or ambulance or anyone else to hand this problem off to. Greta wrapped him in blankets and positioned him by the stove, close enough to warm, but not close enough to burn. His breathing was shallow but steadier now, his color marginally better. He might make it, he might not. All she could do was wait and see which way the night decided to go. She sat back against the wall, exhausted, and let herself look at what she'd done. 20 years of isolation, 20 years of careful solitude, and in one moment of instinct, she'd brought a stranger into her home. A stranger who carried a gun and bore the marks of violence. A stranger who might bring whatever he was running from right to her door. But as she sat there, watching his chest rise and fall in the firelight, Greta felt something she hadn't felt in 2 decades. Not regret, not fear, something else entirely. For the first time since Samuel's watch had stopped at 3:47, Greta Lorne felt alive. Greta dozed in fitful intervals throughout the night, jerking awake every hour to check the stranger's breathing, to feed the fire, to reassure herself that she hadn't imagined the whole thing. Each time she woke, he was still there, real, solid, unconscious. His face would twitch occasionally, lips moving around words she couldn't hear, his body fighting battles in dreams or memories. Around 3 in the morning, she finally made herself examine the saddlebag. It had thawed enough to open, the leather stiff but workable under her fingers. She felt like a thief going through someone else's belongings, but the gun at his belt and the marks on his wrists had made it necessary. She needed to know what she'd brought into her home. The first thing she found was money. Not a few bills, but stacks of them bundled with rubber bands. Her hands trembled as she counted, $47,000 give or take. More money than she'd seen in one place in her entire life. Money that had to be stolen, had to be dirty, had to mean trouble of a kind she couldn't begin to imagine. Beneath the money, wrapped in a plastic bag to keep it dry, was a photograph. The edges were soft from handling, the colors faded by time and touch. A young woman stared at the camera, dark hair falling past her shoulders, smile genuine and warm. On the back, in handwriting that matched the stranger's rough hands, Rachel, 1987, I'm sorry. The third item made her stomach turn. A loaded revolver, twin to the one at his belt. This one showed signs of recent firing. The smell of gun oil and burned powder still faint on the metal. Greta sat back. The contents of the bag spread before her like evidence in a trial. This man, whoever he was, carried the weight of violence and loss and enough money to disappear forever. He was running, that much was clear. Running from the law, maybe. Running from people worse than the law, probably. She should turn him over to Sheriff Bridger the moment the storm cleared. Should let someone else deal with this mess she'd pulled out of the snow. But even as the thought formed, she knew she couldn't, not because of any nobility or courage, but because the moment she'd dragged him inside, she'd made a choice. And Greta Lorne, for all her faults, had never been the kind of person who unmade her choices just because they turned out to be harder than expected. She repacked the saddlebag, leaving it within reach but out of sight, and returned to her vigil by the stove. Outside, the storm continued its assault on the mountain, wind screaming like something wounded and angry. She'd seen storms last 3 days before, sometimes 4. They'd be locked in here together, her and this stranger with his secrets and his violence and his sorry photograph, until the weather decided to let them go. Dawn came grey and reluctant, barely distinguishable from the darkness that preceded it. Greta stood at the window, watching snow pile against the porch railing, erasing the world beyond her cabin. The storm showed no signs of breaking. If anything, it had intensified overnight, the kind of weather that killed people who weren't prepared, who didn't respect the mountain's power. Behind her, the stranger stirred for the first time. A groan, low and pained, then the sound of someone trying to move and discovering their body wouldn't cooperate. Greta turned from the window slowly, giving him time to orient himself, to understand where he was before she approached. His eyes opened, grey-blue, sharp despite the pain evident in every line of his face. He took in the cabin, the fire, Greta standing 6 feet away with her arms crossed. His hand moved instinctively toward his belt, finding the gun missing, and his body tensed. "It's on the table," Greta said, her voice steady. "Along with the one from your bag. I'm not interested in shooting you, but I'm not interested in being shot either, so we'll keep them where they are for now." He stared at her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Fair enough." His voice was rough, damaged by cold and shouting, or both. "You pulled me inside. I did. Shouldn't have. Maybe not, Greta agreed. But it's done now. He tried to sit up, managed it on the second attempt, leaning heavily against the wall. She could see him cataloguing his injuries, taking stock of what worked and what didn't. The bruises on his face had darkened overnight, painting his cheekbone in shades of purple and green. The rope burns on his wrists looked raw and painful. How long? He asked. I found you around 7 last night. It's 6 now. Morning, in case you can't tell from the light. He glanced toward the window, taking in the wall of white beyond the glass. Storm's still going? Storm's still going, she confirmed. Radio says it'll be at least 2 more days before the roads are passable. Longer before anyone could get up here. Something flickered across his face, relief or fear. She couldn't tell which. Maybe both. I should go. Soon as I can walk. You can barely sit up, Greta pointed out. And there's nowhere to go in this weather. You'd die before you made it a mile. Might be better that way. The words hung in the air between them, stark and honest. Greta heard the truth in them, the exhaustion that went deeper than cold or injury. She'd felt that exhaustion herself, felt it every day for the past 20 years. The weariness of someone who'd stopped believing there was any point to surviving. I made soup, she said, instead of addressing his death wish. You should eat something. She didn't wait for his answer, just moved to the stove and ladled broth into a bowl. When she brought it to him, their hands touched briefly as he took it from her, his still ice-cold, despite the hours by the fire, hers warm and steady. He looked at the soup like he didn't quite remember how to eat, then raised it to his lips and drank carefully. Greta returned to her chair and let the silence stretch. She'd learned a long time ago that sometimes silence extracted more truth than questions ever could. People felt compelled to fill the quiet, to explain themselves, to justify their presence. She just had to wait. He finished half the bowl before setting it aside. His hands shook, whether from cold or weakness or something else entirely. You went through my things, he said finally. I did. See anything interesting? Saw enough to know you're in trouble. The kind of trouble that follows people, he laughed, a bitter sound without humor. That's an understatement. You want to tell me what kind of trouble? Or should I just wait for it to show up at my door? His jaw tightened, and for a moment she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he sighed, the sound of someone too tired to keep carrying their secrets alone. The money's mine. Legally, more or less. I've been moving it for 15 years, every time I had to start over. Start over from what? From people who want me dead. He met her eyes, his gaze direct and unflinching. My name is Reeve Calder. 15 years ago, I testified against some very bad people in a federal case. Sent 3 of them to prison for crimes that should have kept them there for life. In return, the government was supposed to keep me safe, give me a new identity, a new life. Witness protection. Doesn't look like it worked, Greta observed. It worked 5 times. 6 relocations in 15 years. Every time I'd start to settle, start to think maybe I could have something like a normal life, they'd find me. I don't know how. Someone leaking information, someone getting paid to look the other way. Doesn't matter anymore. 6 months ago they found me again. Got close enough to... He stopped, swallowed hard. Got close enough that I knew I was out of second chances. So you ran. So I ran. Been running since October. Thought maybe if I went remote enough, high enough, they'd lose the trail. Or I'd freeze to death before they found me. He gestured to the cabin, to her. Didn't account for someone stubborn enough to drag a stranger out of a blizzard. Greta absorbed this, turning it over in her mind. A federal witness. People hunting him for 15 years. Money saved from a life lived in pieces, never staying anywhere long enough to call it home. It explained the bruises, the rope burns, the gun. It didn't explain why someone would beat him and leave him on a mountain in a storm instead of just killing him outright. The bruises, she said. That wasn't from the cold. Reeve's hand went unconsciously to his ribs, pressing against what she suspected were cracked bones beneath. They caught up with me 3 days ago. 2 men. Wanted to know where I'd hidden something. Some evidence they think I kept from the trial. I don't have it. Never did. But they didn't believe me. They tortured you. He didn't flinch from the word. Yes, then left you to die in the storm. They figured nature would finish what they started. No body, no evidence, no questions. Just another person who got lost in the mountains and never came out. Greta stood and walked to the window, needing distance from the casual way he described his own attempted murder. Outside, the storm continued its work, burying tracks, erasing evidence, doing exactly what his would-be killers had counted on. She thought about the money in the saddlebag, the guns on her table, the photograph of a woman named Rachel who'd warranted an apology 38 years ago. "The woman in the picture," she said, without turning around. "Your wife?" She died because of my testimony. Car accident that wasn't an accident." His voice had gone flat, empty of everything except old pain. "They couldn't get to me, so they got to her instead." Greta turned to face him, understanding settling into place like pieces of a puzzle she hadn't known she was solving. "You've been running for 15 years, waiting for them to catch you, waiting for it to be over, pretty much. And when they did catch you, you let them. Didn't fight as hard as you could have. Figured maybe you deserved whatever they did to you." Reeve's expression hardened. "You don't know me." "No," Greta agreed. "But I know guilt. Know what it looks like when someone spent years punishing themselves for being alive, when someone they loved isn't." The silence that followed was different from before, heavier, weighted with recognition. Finally, Reeve spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "Her last words to me were, 'Be careful.' I wasn't careful enough." Greta thought of Samuel, of their last argument, of her cutting words and his quiet exit, of the watch stopped at 3:47 and 20 years, spent trying to freeze time at the moment before she'd failed him. "Her last words to me were, 'Maybe I should have married someone who wasn't always leaving.' He died 6 hours later." Reeve looked at her then, really looked at her, and what he saw in her face made his own expression soften. "Guess we're both experts at not forgiving ourselves." "Guess so." Greta moved back to her chair, suddenly exhausted. "Which makes this situation complicated. I pulled you inside because something in me couldn't walk away. Now you're telling me that by saving you, I might have painted a target on this cabin. Yes, and these people who are hunting. They're the type to hurt anyone who gets in there." "Wait, yes. Then I need to know exactly what I'm dealing with. Everything, no more pieces. If I'm going to decide whether to turn you over to the sheriff or help you get off this mountain, I need the whole truth." Reeve studied her for a long moment, then reached into his shirt and pulled out a folded sheaf of papers, yellowed and worn from years of carrying. "This is what I testified about. The Garrett brothers, Malcolm, Richard, and Marcus. They ran a land acquisition operation across Montana and Wyoming. When people wouldn't sell, they made them, burned them out, threatened their families, killed anyone who fought back. 17 confirmed deaths, probably more that couldn't be proven." He handed her the papers, and she read through them slowly. Legal documents, testimony transcripts, photocopies of news articles about mysterious fires and suspicious accidents. And photographs, crime scene photographs of burned ranches, murdered families, the kind of violence that left no room for mercy or second thoughts. "I worked for them," Reeve continued, his voice steady but his eyes haunted. "Didn't know what I was part of at first. Thought it was just business, just pressure tactics to get people to sell. Then I saw what they did to the Morrison family. Parents and 3 kids, youngest was 5. Locked them in their house and burned it down around them because the father refused to sell his land." Greta's hands tightened on the papers. "You went to the feds." "I went to the feds. Testified against all 3 brothers. Malcolm and Richard are dead now, prison and old age. But Marcus got out 6 months ago. He's the one who's been hunting me. He's the one who caught me 3 days ago. And he's the one who knows you came up this mountain." Reeve's expression was answer enough. The storm might have covered his tracks, might have bought them a few days, but eventually the weather would break. Eventually, Marcus Garrett would come looking for the man who destroyed his family's operation and sent him to prison for 15 years. And when he did, he'd find Greta's cabin. He'd find her. Greta looked at the papers in her hands, then at the stranger, Reeve Calder, sitting by her stove, wounded and exhausted and still somehow alive, despite everything that had tried to kill him. She thought about her 20 years of isolation, her careful solitude, her determination to never again be responsible for someone else's survival. She thought about Samuel's watch and the moment frozen at 3:47. Then she made her decision. The storm will break in 2 days. Give or take, she said, refolding the papers and handing them back. That's how long we have to figure out what happens next. I'm not turning you over to the sheriff, and I'm not throwing you back out in the snow. But I'm also not going to die for someone I just met. So we're going to come up with a plan, together, and then we're going to hope like hell it works. Reeve stared at her, something like wonder crossing his face. Why would you do that? Risk your life for mine? Greta thought about the question, about all the easy answers she could give. Because it's the right thing. Because I already made my choice when I opened the door. Because I'm stubborn and foolish and apparently incapable of learning from past mistakes. But what came out was simpler and more honest than any of that. Because for 20 years I've been dead inside, she said quietly. And saving you made me feel alive again. I'm not ready to give that up yet. Outside, the storm howled its approval or its warning. Inside, 2 broken people sat by a fire and began the work of figuring out how to survive what was coming. The clock on the mantel stayed stopped at 3:47. But somewhere in Greta's chest, something that had been frozen for 2 decades began, slowly and painfully, to thaw. The first full day of their confinement passed in careful silence. Greta went about her routines with mechanical precision, but everything felt different now. Cooking for 2 instead of 1. Rationing supplies with an extra person in mind. The simple mathematics of survival had changed, and she found herself calculating resources in ways she hadn't needed to for 20 years. Reeve spent most of the day drifting between sleep and waking, his body demanding rest even as his mind clearly fought against vulnerability. When he was conscious, he watched her with wary attention, tracking her movements around the cabin like someone expecting betrayal. She couldn't blame him. After 15 years of being found and hunted, trust probably felt like a luxury he couldn't afford. By evening, he was strong enough to sit up without leaning against the wall. She brought him more soup and a piece of bread she'd baked that morning. He took it with a quiet thanks, and she noticed how he ate slowly, carefully, like someone who'd learned not to take food for granted. You should have asked me to leave, he said when he finished. Soon as I told you what was coming. Greta was at the window, watching darkness fall over the continuing storm. You already suggested that. I already said no. I'm trying to understand why. She turned to look at him then, this stranger who'd landed on her porch like some kind of test she hadn't studied for. In better light, cleaned up and rested, she could see what he must have looked like before violence and running had carved away everything soft. Strong bones, steady hands despite the tremor, eyes that had seen too much but hadn't gone dead yet. You want the truth? She asked. I don't fully understand it myself. 20 years I've spent avoiding exactly this. People, responsibility, caring what happens to anyone but myself. Then you show up half dead in a blizzard, and something in me couldn't walk away. Still can't. That something might get you killed. Might, she agreed. But living the way I have been, that's been killing me slow for 2 decades. At least this way I'll know I chose something. Reeve absorbed this, his expression unreadable. Then his gaze shifted to the mantel, to Samuel's watch, frozen at 3:47. How long ago? 20 years this spring. And you've been up here alone ever since? More or less. I take jobs sometimes, go down to the valley once a month for supplies. But yes, alone, by choice. Punishment or protection? The question cut closer than she expected. Both, probably. Felt like if I stayed here, stayed isolated, I couldn't fail anyone else. Couldn't say the wrong thing at the wrong time. Couldn't be absent when someone needed me. Your husband, Reeve said quietly. You weren't there when he died. I was buying coffee and arguing about the price. He was leading tourists up a mountain. The avalanche took him and 4 others. I found out when the sheriff drove up 6 hours later. The words came out flat, rehearsed from 20 years of repetition. We'd fought that morning. I said terrible things. He left angry. Those were my last words to him, angry words about him always leaving, never being home enough. 6 hours later, he was gone. Reeve was quiet for a long moment. Then my wife and I fought the night before the accident. She wanted me to stop working for the Garretts, said she had a bad feeling about them. I told her she was being paranoid, that the money was good and we needed it. Next morning, I left for work. That afternoon, the brakes on her car failed on a mountain road. He paused. Wasn't until the trial that I learned they'd been cut. The Garretts wanted to send me a message. Keep your mouth shut, or the people you love pay the price. But you didn't keep your mouth shut. No. By then, she was already dead. Seemed pointless to let her die for nothing. They sat with that for a while, two people bound by the weight of last words and permanent absences. Outside, the wind howled, and snow continued to pile against the cabin walls, sealing them in together with their histories and their guilt. "The photograph in your bag," Greta said. "You've been carrying it for 15 years. Reeve's hand went unconsciously to his chest, where the papers from his testimony were tucked back inside his shirt. "Longer, since the day of her funeral. Feels like if I let go of it, I'm letting go of her. Of the last good thing I had before everything went wrong. I know that feeling." Greta gestured to the watch. Samuel's stopped at the exact moment the avalanche hit. "I've wound it once, day of his funeral. It ran for 12 hours and stopped again at the same time. Haven't touched it since. Part of me is afraid if I wind it again, if I let time move forward, I'll be leaving him behind. Maybe that's what we're both doing," Reeve said. "Staying frozen at the moment we lost them. Afraid that moving forward means forgetting, means we didn't love them enough, means their deaths didn't matter." The observation landed like a stone in still water, sending ripples through certainties Greta had held for 2 decades. She wanted to argue, to defend her choices, to explain that it wasn't that simple. But the truth was, it might be exactly that simple. She'd stopped her life at 3:47 because moving past that moment felt like betrayal. Before she could respond, a sound outside cut through the storm's howl. Sharp, distinct, wrong. Greta's body went rigid, every sense suddenly alert. Reeve heard it too, his hand moving toward where his gun wasn't, old instincts taking over. "What was that?" he asked, voice low. "Don't know. Could be a branch breaking under snow. Could be an animal." But even as she said it, Greta knew it wasn't. That sound had been deliberate, purposeful, the sound of something or someone moving through the storm. She moved to the window, keeping to the side where she couldn't be seen from outside. The storm made visibility nearly impossible, but she knew her land, knew what belonged and what didn't, and there at the edge of the tree line, barely visible through the snow, a shape that didn't match the landscape. Too tall to be an animal, too still to be natural. Someone was out there, watching. Greta's blood went cold. The storm had been their protection, their buffer against pursuit. But someone had come anyway, had climbed the mountain in conditions that should have been impossible, had found her cabin despite the blizzard erasing all tracks. "We have company," she said quietly. Reeve was on his feet despite his injuries, moving to her side. He looked where she pointed and she saw his jaw tighten. "How many?" "Can't tell. 1 for certain. Maybe more. They couldn't have followed me. Not in this weather, unless they already knew where to look." Greta's mind raced through possibilities. The town. Someone in the valley might have talked. Strangers asking questions about a man heading into the mountains. People remember things like that. The shape at the tree line moved, becoming briefly clearer. A man bundled against the storm, definitely watching the cabin. Then the snow swallowed him again, and he was gone, or not gone. Just waiting. Reeve reached for the table where his guns lay, but Greta caught his arm. "Not yet. If we start shooting, we don't know what we're shooting at or how many there are. Could be someone lost in the storm. Could be a ranger checking cabins. You know that's not what it is. Maybe, but we don't confirm anything by reacting. We wait, we watch, we see what they do next." It went against every instinct, but Reeve nodded. They moved away from the window, extinguishing the lamp so they couldn't be silhouetted against the light. In the darkness, lit only by the glow from the stove, they prepared for whatever was coming. Greta retrieved Samuel's hunting rifle from the bedroom, the Winchester 30-30 that had been her constant companion during her guiding years. She checked the load automatically, muscle memory taking over. Beside her, Reeve had reclaimed one of his revolvers, holding it with the easy familiarity of someone who'd used guns before and would again. "I'm sorry," he said into the darkness. "Sorry for bringing this to your door. Save your apologies," Greta replied, her voice steady despite the fear threading through her chest. "We're not dead yet. And I've survived worse than men with guns in a snowstorm." It was a lie, but a useful one. The truth was, in 20 years of isolation, she'd never faced anything like this. Never had to defend herself against human violence. Never had to choose between her safety and someone else's survival. But she'd made her choice when she opened the door to Reeve Calder. Now she'd live with it or die with it, but she wouldn't unmake it. Outside, the shape at the tree line reappeared closer this time. And this time Greta could see he wasn't alone. 2 more figures materialized from the storm, converging on the cabin with patient, inexorable purpose. The siege had begun. The 3 figures didn't approach the cabin directly. Instead, they spread out, taking positions that suggested military training or at least tactical awareness. One to the north, one to the south, one remaining at the tree line with a clear view of the front door. They were setting up a perimeter, establishing control before making contact. Greta watched from the darkened window, her rifle ready but not aimed. Beside her, Reeve's breathing had gone quiet and controlled, the kind of stillness that came from experience with dangerous situations. She wondered what he'd done before working for the Garretts, what background had prepared him for moments like this. "They're professionals," Reeve murmured, "or at least trained. See how they're positioned. Classic 3-point coverage. No blind spots, overlapping fields of fire. How long before they move? Depends on what they want. If they're here to kill us, they'd have started shooting already. They're waiting for something." As if in answer, a voice carried through the storm, amplified somehow to cut through the wind. "Mrs. Lorne, we know you're in there. We just want to talk." Greta's jaw tightened. They knew her name, knew this was her cabin, which meant they'd done more than just follow Reeve up the mountain. They'd researched, prepared, planned. This wasn't a random encounter. This was a carefully executed operation. "Don't answer," Reeve said quietly. "Let them wonder if we're here, if we're armed, if we're willing to shoot." But Greta was already calculating odds. 3 men outside, 2 people inside. One of those 2 people was injured and exhausted. The other was a 58-year-old woman who hadn't fired a gun at anything but elk and paper targets in years. If this turned into a firefight, the math wasn't in their favor. "What do they want?" she called back, her voice carrying the authority she'd used as a guide, the tone that said she was in charge of her mountain, and they were trespassing. A pause, then the voice again. "Just to talk. Just to retrieve something that belongs to us. Nobody has to get hurt." "Lies," Reeve breathed. "Everything they say from here on is designed to get us to lower our guard, to open the door, to give them an advantage." "I know that," Greta said. "But maybe we can learn something, find out what they know, what they think we have." She moved to the door, staying to the side where a bullet couldn't reach her through the wood. "Talk then. But you stay right where you are. Come any closer, I start shooting." Another pause. Then a different voice, this one colder, more controlled. "My name is Marcus Garrett. I believe you're sheltering a man named Reeve Calder. I'm not interested in you, Mrs. Lorne. I'm interested in him. Send him out. You get to go back to your peaceful mountain life. Hide him and we have a problem." Marcus. The brother who'd gotten out of prison 6 months ago. The one who'd caught Reeve 3 days ago and left him to die in the storm. Greta felt Reeve tense beside her, old fear and older hatred warring in his expression. "How did you find this place?" Greta asked. "Small towns, Mrs. Lorne. People talk." Old man at the general store mentioned a hermit woman who lives alone on the mountain. Woman who keeps to herself, but has a kind heart under the hard exterior. I thought to myself, if a dying man made it this far up, where would he go? Who might be foolish enough to take him in? There was dark amusement in Marcus's voice. You were the obvious answer. I haven't seen anyone, Greta lied. Been alone through the storm, same as always. Then you won't mind if we come in and confirm that. Quick search just to satisfy my curiosity. I mind. This is private property, and you're trespassing. Turn around and head back down the mountain before this gets ugly. Marcus laughed, the sound carrying menace despite the storm. Mrs. Lorne, I respect your courage. I do, but let's be realistic. There are 3 of us, and 1 of you. We're young, armed, and motivated. You're alone and protecting someone who isn't worth dying for. You'd be surprised what people are worth dying for, Greta said. Then, before Marcus could respond, she fired a single shot through the door, aimed high and to the left. Nowhere near where she thought he was standing, but close enough to make a point. The crack of the rifle echoed across the mountain, sharp and definitive. Silence followed, broken only by the storm's howl and the hammering of Greta's heart. When Marcus spoke again, the amusement was gone. That was stupid. Now we know you're armed and hostile. Now we have to approach this differently. Good, Greta called back. Different approach means time. Time means the storm might break. Storm breaks, people come looking. You want to explain to the valley residents what you're doing up here, threatening a woman on her own property. Another pause, longer this time. She'd scored a point, forced them to recalculate. But she also knew she'd escalated the situation. The warning shot meant there would be no easy resolution, no simple surrender. Blood had been promised, even if none had been spilled yet. Reeve touched her shoulder, and when she looked at him, his expression was pained. You shouldn't have done that. Shouldn't have made yourself a target for me. Little late for should and shouldn't, Greta said. We're in it now. Both of us. Then we need a plan better than waiting for them to storm the cabin. Agreed. Greta moved away from the door, back to the window where she could see the shape still holding position. I know this mountain better than anyone alive. Every trail, every cave, every place the snow drifts deep. If we can get out of this cabin, I can lose them in terrain they've never seen before. Big if. They've got us surrounded, not completely. There's a root cellar, accessible from the bedroom. Samuel built it as a storm shelter, put in an exit tunnel that comes out 50 yards north of the cabin. It's tight, barely wide enough for a person to crawl through, but it's there. Hope flickered across Reeve's face. They wouldn't know about it. No reason they would. I'm the only one who's used it in 20 years. Greta was already planning, mind racing through logistics. We wait until full dark. Storm's loud enough to cover sounds. We slip out through the tunnel, get to the tree line, work our way around their positions. Then what? We can't outrun them, not with me in this condition. We don't outrun them. We outlast them. I've got a backup cache about 3 miles north, old guiding emergency shelter Samuel and I built. Food, supplies, firewood. We hole up there. Let them waste time searching the cabin. Eventually, they'll have to go back down, and we can figure out our next move. It was a plan built on hope and desperation, but it was better than sitting in the cabin waiting to be overrun. Reeve studied her face, then nodded slowly. All right, but if something goes wrong, if they catch us in the open, you run. Don't try to fight them, don't try to save me. Just run. I'm not going to agree to that. Greta, I'm not, she said firmly. We do this together or we don't do it at all. I didn't drag you out of a blizzard just to abandon you the first time things got complicated. Outside, the shapes began moving again, conferring at the tree line. Whatever they were planning, it wouldn't wait forever. Marcus Garrett hadn't climbed a mountain in a blizzard to turn back at the first obstacle. Greta checked her watch. 4 hours until full darkness. 4 hours to prepare, to gather what they could carry, to steel themselves for what came next. She moved to the bedroom and pulled up the rug that covered the trapdoor to the root cellar. The wood was old but solid, hinges Samuel had oiled every year until the year he died. She hadn't opened it in a decade, but when she pulled, it lifted smoothly. Below, darkness and the smell of earth. The tunnel beyond waiting. 4 hours, she said to Reeve. Rest while you can. Eat something. When we go fast and we don't stop. He nodded, already moving to follow her instructions. But as Greta closed the trapdoor and returned to her vigil at the window, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were missing something. that Marcus Garrett was too calm, too confident, that he knew more than he was saying. The shapes outside had stopped moving again, settled into position like they had all the time in the world. Like they were waiting for something other than darkness or surrender, like they knew about the tunnel already. Greta pushed the thought away. Paranoia wouldn't help them now. They had a plan, they had a chance, and they had 4 hours to make it work. It would have to be enough, but as she watched the storm rage and the men outside hold their patient vigil, she couldn't help remembering something Samuel used to say: "The mountain always knows more than you think it does, and it never gives anything away for free." Tonight, she suspected, the price of survival was going to be higher than either of them wanted to pay. The 4 hours stretched like wire pulled to breaking. Greta and Reeve moved through the cabin with quiet efficiency, packing supplies they could carry, preparing for a night in the mountains that could kill them as easily as the men outside. She'd done this before: emergency kits for lost hikers, survival packs for extended trips into the backcountry, but never with bullets and violence waiting on the other side of her door. Reeve ate what she gave him, drank water, tried to rest despite the tension vibrating through every board of the cabin. His color was better, his breathing steadier, but he was still recovering from 3 days of exposure and torture. The escape ahead would test him beyond what his body was ready for. "Tell me about the cache," he said as darkness finally began to fall. "What we're walking into. It's a small cabin, more of a shack, really. Samuel and I built it 20 years ago as an emergency shelter for guided trips. Stone foundation, log walls, good roof, fireplace that draws clean, shutters on the windows. We kept it stocked with basics: dried food, blankets, first aid supplies. I haven't been there in 5 years, but the structure should be sound. 3 miles north, through a storm, with armed men hunting us." "When you put it that way, it sounds almost exciting," Greta said, and was surprised to hear something like humor in her voice. Gallows humor maybe, but humor nonetheless. Reeve smiled despite himself. "You're a strange woman, Greta Lorne. Takes one to know one," Reeve Calder. They fell quiet, listening to the storm and the silence from outside. The men hadn't made another attempt at communication, hadn't adjusted their positions. The patience bothered Greta more than threats would have. Patient men were dangerous men, men who'd thought through possibilities and prepared for contingencies. As full darkness settled, Greta made her final preparations. She dressed in layers, knowing they'd need to manage body heat carefully. Too cold and they'd die, too hot, and the sweat would freeze them when they stopped moving. She packed the Winchester and extra ammunition, a knife, waterproof matches, emergency flares. The basics of survival weighted against the reality that they might not survive at all. "It's time," she said finally. Reeve pulled himself to his feet, slower than she would have liked, but steady enough. He'd armed himself with both revolvers and the determination of someone who'd run out of other options. "I'm ready." They moved to the bedroom, and Greta pulled up the trapdoor. The darkness below seemed absolute, a mouth waiting to swallow them. She descended first, testing the ladder Samuel had built, finding it solid despite years of neglect. Reeve followed, his movements careful but competent. The root cellar was small and close, walls of earth held back by timber supports. The tunnel entrance was at the far end, a hole barely 3 feet high that disappeared into blackness. Greta lit a small LED flashlight, keeping the beam low and directed at the ground. "No point advertising their position with light. Stay close," she whispered. "The tunnel's about 40 yards long. Comes out in a drainage ditch covered by deadfall. Once we're out, we move fast and quiet. Don't stop, don't look back. Just follow me." "Understood." Greta dropped to her hands and knees and entered the tunnel. The earth was cold and damp, the air stale from years of being sealed. She crawled forward, the Winchester slung across her back, the flashlight held between her teeth. Behind her, she could hear Reeve following, his breathing labored but controlled. The tunnel seemed to stretch forever, narrowing in places until she had to exhale completely to squeeze through. Her shoulders scraped against earth and timber, and more than once she had to fight down panic at the weight of the mountain pressing above her. Samuel had built this tunnel to save lives, but right now it felt more like a grave. Then the flashlight beam found empty space ahead, the exit. Greta pushed forward with renewed urgency, emerging into the drainage ditch he'd described. Snow had drifted over the deadfall covering, creating a natural camouflage that had held for 20 years. She pushed through carefully, mindful of noise, and crawled out into the storm. The cold hit her like a physical force, stealing her breath and biting through her layers. She moved immediately to the side, making room for Reeve, scanning the darkness for shapes or movement. The storm had intensified, visibility down to maybe 10 feet. It would hide them, but it would also hide their pursuers. Reeve emerged from the tunnel, his face pale but determined. Greta helped him to his feet, and together they oriented themselves. North, 3 miles. Through terrain she knew in daylight, but had rarely traveled at night, never in a blizzard. They set off, Greta leading, Reeve staying close behind. She didn't use the flashlight. Better to let their eyes adjust to the darkness, to trust the memory of trails she'd walked 1,000 times. The snow was deep, each step an effort, and within minutes her legs burned with exertion. Behind her she could hear Reeve's labored breathing, the sound of someone pushing past their limits. They'd covered maybe half a mile when the first shot split the night. The crack of a rifle, close enough to make them both drop instinctively. The bullet hit a tree to their left, bark exploding in the darkness. Another shot, then another, coming from their right. Not aimed shots, these were designed to panic, to flush them out, to force mistakes. They knew about the tunnel, Reeve gasped. "Move!" Greta hauled him to his feet, abandoning stealth for speed. They ran, stumbling through drifts, branches tearing at their faces. More shots behind them, getting closer. The men must have night vision or thermal scopes, some technological advantage that negated the storm's protection. Greta's mind raced. The cache was too far, and they'd never make it at this pace. She needed an alternative, a place to hide or defend, somewhere the mountain itself could provide advantage. Then she remembered. The old copper mine, abandoned since the 70s, entrance about a quarter-mile west. Narrow passages, multiple chambers, places to hide or make a stand. "Change of plans," she shouted over the storm. "Follow me!" She veered west, hoping her memory was accurate, hoping the entrance hadn't collapsed in the decades since she'd last explored it. Reeve followed without question, trusting her in a way that felt both terrifying and oddly right. The mine entrance appeared like a black mouth in the mountainside, partially obscured by brush and fallen timber. Greta didn't hesitate, plunging into the darkness with Reeve right behind her. The transition from storm to stillness was jarring, the howl of wind suddenly muted by stone and earth. They were 20 feet inside when they heard voices outside, Marcus and his men closing in. Greta pulled Reeve deeper into the mine, following passages from memory, taking turns that led away from the entrance. The darkness was absolute, forcing her to use the flashlight despite the risk. The beam showed rough walls, support timbers dark with age, passages that branched and twisted into the mountain's heart. "How well do you know this place?" Reeve whispered. "Well enough. Samuel and I explored it years ago. Most of it's stable, but there are shafts and dead ends. We need to find a defensible position before they come in after us." They pushed deeper, putting distance between themselves and the entrance. Greta's mind was working through options, none of them good. They were trapped now, backed into a corner of their own choosing. If Marcus decided to just wait them out, they'd eventually have to emerge or die of exposure in the mine's cold depths. But at least in here, the numbers were more even. Narrow passages meant Marcus's men couldn't surround them, couldn't use superior firepower to overwhelming advantage. It was a gamble, but everything about the last 2 days had been a gamble. They found a chamber about 100 yards in, where the passage widened enough to breathe, but narrow enough to defend. A single entrance, walls of solid rock, enough space to move. Greta positioned herself where she could see the passage, Winchester ready. Reeve took up position beside her, both revolvers drawn. "This is crazy," he said quietly. "We're trapped." "They have us." "Maybe," Greta agreed. Or maybe they just trapped themselves in a dark mine where I know every passage and they know nothing. Mountain warfare, Reeve. Sometimes the best advantage isn't numbers or guns. It's knowing the ground better than your enemy does. Voices echoed from the entrance, distorted by distance and acoustics. Marcus and his men had reached the mine. Now came the question. Would they follow into the darkness, into terrain where they'd lost every advantage? Or would they wait and try to starve Greta and Reeve out? The answer came in the form of flashlight beams penetrating the darkness, multiple sources moving into the passages. They were coming, confident in their numbers, their weapons, their belief that two exhausted people couldn't stand against three prepared men. Greta allowed herself a grim smile. They were about to learn what it meant to hunt someone on their home ground. Samuel had taught her these mountains, every cave, every passage, every way the stone could be turned from shelter into weapon. "Get ready," she whispered to Reeve. "We're going to make them regret following us in here." The flashlight beams grew closer, and in their harsh illumination Greta could see Reeve's face, battered, exhausted, but alive with something like hope. They'd made it this far. They'd survived the cabin, escaped the siege, found shelter when it seemed impossible. Now they just had to survive the next hour, and the hour after that, and however many hours it took for Marcus Garrett to realize that some mountains and some people don't surrender easily. The first flashlight beam found their passage, and Greta raised the Winchester to her shoulder. "Here we go," she murmured and squeezed the trigger. The rifle shot thundered through the mine passages, amplified by stone walls, until it sounded like the mountain itself was roaring. The flashlight beam disappeared instantly, followed by shouting and the scramble of boots on rock. Greta had aimed high and to the side, a warning, not a killing shot. "Not yet. Fall back," Marcus's voice echoed from somewhere in the darkness. "Regroup at the entrance." The beams retreated, leaving Greta and Reeve in darkness again. She didn't allow herself to feel relief. This was just the opening move, a test to see if they were armed, willing to shoot, capable of defending themselves. Marcus had his answer now. The question was what he'd do with it. "That bought us maybe 10 minutes, Reeve said quietly. "Then they'll come back with a better plan. Then we use those 10 minutes. Greta was already moving, pulling Reeve with her deeper into the mine. "There's another chamber about 50 yards back, with multiple exit passages. We can't let them pin us down in one location." They moved through darkness, Greta using her flashlight in brief, controlled bursts to check their path. The mine was exactly as she remembered, a maze of passages carved by men chasing copper veins that had run out decades ago. Some tunnels led to dead ends, others connected to natural caves that went even deeper into the mountain. It was easy to get lost down here, easy to die if you didn't know the way out. That knowledge was their only real advantage. They reached the chamber Greta had been seeking, a junction where 4 passages met, each leading in different directions. She paused, getting her bearings, remembering which passages were safe and which led to collapsed sections or dangerous shafts. "Listen," she said, keeping her voice low. "2 of these passages are dead ends. One leads to a vertical shaft that drops about 40 feet. The 4th goes deeper, but eventually circles back toward the entrance. If they split up to search, they'll have to make guesses. We just have to make sure we're always in a passage they're not. That's a hell of a strategy. Hope they guess wrong, and we guess right. You have a better idea." Reeve was quiet for a moment. "Actually, no. It's better than anything I could come up with." Voices echoed from the direction they'd come. Marcus and his men moving into the mine again. This time they were more cautious, their approach slower and more coordinated. Greta strained to hear how many sets of footsteps, trying to gauge if they'd all come in or if someone had stayed outside to guard the entrance. 3 distinct voices, 3 flashlight beams. All of them had committed to the chase. That was both good and bad. No one outside to block their escape, but also no margin for error if they got cornered. "Split up," Marcus's voice carried through the passages. "Check every branch. They can't have gone far, and there's only so many places to hide. The beams separated, taking different passages. Greta watched their light dance across stone walls, calculating angles and distances. One beam was coming toward their junction. They had maybe 60 seconds before whoever was carrying it reached them. "Come on," she whispered, pulling Reeve into the passage that led deeper into the mountain. They moved fast but carefully, mindful of loose rock that could give away their position. Behind them, the approaching flashlight beam grew stronger. The passage narrowed, forcing them to move single file. Greta's shoulders brushed both walls, and she had to duck to avoid hitting her head on the low ceiling. She could hear Reeve behind her, his breathing labored, the sounds of someone pushing past exhaustion into something approaching collapse. They needed to stop, to rest, but stopping meant being found. So they kept moving, following the passage as it twisted deeper into the mountain. After what felt like an eternity but was probably only minutes, the passage opened into another chamber, this one natural rather than man-made, with a ceiling that disappeared into darkness and walls that glistened with mineral deposits. Greta killed her flashlight and listened. No sound of pursuit behind them, no beams cutting through the darkness. Either they'd lost their tracker or he'd taken one of the other passages. For the moment they had breathing room. "We can rest," she whispered. 5 minutes. "Then we keep moving." Reeve sank against the wall, his legs giving out. In the darkness, she could hear him trying to control his breathing, fighting against the panic of exhaustion and pain, and being hunted like an animal. She knelt beside him, finding his shoulder in the dark, offering what comfort she could through simple touch. "I'm sorry," he said finally, his voice ragged. "Sorry you're in here with me. Sorry I can't move faster, be more useful. You're here. You're alive. That's useful enough." Greta pulled out her canteen and pressed it into his hands. A drink, not too much, but enough to keep going. He drank, then passed it back. "Tell me about Samuel. Tell me something good about him." The request surprised her, but in the darkness and danger, she found herself wanting to answer. He laughed at his own jokes. Terrible jokes, the kind that make you groan, but he'd laugh like they were the funniest thing he'd ever heard. Used to drive me crazy. Now I'd give anything to hear one more bad joke. Rachel sang in the shower, Reeve said softly. Off-key, usually songs she'd make up on the spot about whatever she was thinking about. I'd tease her about it, tell her to stick to her day job. She'd just sing louder. He paused. I haven't thought about that in years. Just remembered it now. They sat in the darkness, two people sharing memories of the dead, while the living hunted them through stone and shadow. It should have felt morbid, but somehow it didn't. Somehow it felt like the most honest conversation Greta had had in 20 years. We're going to get out of this, she said finally. I don't know how yet, but we are. And when we do, maybe we stop living in the past. Stop punishing ourselves for being alive when they're not. That would be nice, Reeve said. But first, we have to survive the next few hours. First, we have to survive the next few hours, Greta agreed. They rested for their 5 minutes, then pushed on. The natural cave led to another passage, this one sloping downward. Greta's mental map of the mine was starting to fray at the edges. They'd gone deeper than she'd ever explored with Samuel, into sections where the copper company's maps ended and the mountain's natural formations began. But downward was still away from Marcus, still buying them time and distance. She followed the slope, trusting her instincts and the mountain's guidance. The air grew colder, damper, heavy with the smell of deep earth and standing water. They emerged into a vast chamber, larger than anything they'd encountered. Greta's flashlight beam couldn't find the far wall, just disappeared into darkness. The sound of dripping water echoed from multiple directions, creating a disorienting acoustic landscape. Where are we? Reeve asked, his voice small in the enormous space. I don't know, Greta admitted. But we're deeper than the mine goes. This is natural cave system, connected to the copper works, but not part of it. Can we get out from here? I don't... Greta stopped. In the distance she could see light, not flashlight beams, but something else. Something that flickered and moved like flame. And with it the smell of wood smoke. Someone else was down here. Someone who'd been here long enough to build a fire. We're not alone, Reeve whispered, his hand finding his revolver. No, Greta agreed, her mind racing through possibilities. Miners who'd gotten lost and died down here? Homeless people seeking shelter from the storm? Or something else? Something she didn't want to consider in a cave system where up and down and out had all become uncertain. But they couldn't go back. Marcus and his men were behind them, probably getting closer. Forward was the only option left, even if forward led toward mysterious firelight and unknown danger. "Stay behind me," Greta said, and started toward the light. As they got closer, details emerged. The fire was in a side chamber, deliberately built with a ring of stones to contain it. Supplies were stacked against the walls, food, water, camping equipment. And sitting by the fire, warming his hands, was a man Greta recognized. Sheriff Tom Bridger looked up as they entered the chamber, his face showing no surprise at their arrival. Just a deep, weary sadness that made Greta's blood run cold. "Hello, Greta," he said quietly. "I was wondering how long it would take you to find your way down here." Greta's rifle came up, centering on the sheriff's chest. Her mind couldn't process what she was seeing. Tom Bridger, Samuel's best friend, the man who'd checked on her for 20 years, sitting in a cave with supplies that suggested he'd been here for days. Sitting here while his friend was hunted above. "Tom," she said, her voice flat. "What are you doing here?" "My job," he said, and the sadness in his eyes deepened. "Or at least what my job has become." "I'm sorry, Greta, I'm so sorry." And in that moment, Greta understood. The patient siege at the cabin, the men who'd known about the tunnel, the perfect coordination of Marcus's team. They'd had help all along. Help from someone who knew the mountain, knew Greta, knew exactly where she'd run when cornered. Help from the one person she'd thought she could still trust. The silence in the cave chamber stretched like ice about to crack. Greta's finger rested on the Winchester's trigger, steady despite the earthquake happening inside her chest. Tom Bridger, Sam's best friend, the man who'd stood beside her at the funeral, who'd checked on her every month for 20 years, sat calmly by his fire and met her eyes without flinching. "Put the rifle down, Greta," he said gently. "I'm not armed. I'm not going to hurt you. No, you're just going to let Marcus Garrett do it for you." Her voice came out harder than stone. "How long, Tom? How long have you been helping them hunt him?" The sheriff's face creased with pain, but he didn't look away. 6 months. "Since Marcus got out of prison." "But it's not what you think." "Then tell me what it is. Make me understand why Samuel's best friend would betray everything he stood for." Tom was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire like he might find answers in the flames. When he spoke, his voice was weighted with years of shame. "My son, you remember Michael? Sweet kid, graduated high school, went to college in Missoula." Greta remembered. "Quiet boy, good student. Samuel had liked him." "What about him?" 5 years ago he was driving home for Christmas break. Hit a patch of ice, went off the road. Car rolled 3 times. Girl in the passenger seat. His girlfriend didn't make it." Tom's hands were shaking now, firelight making the tremors look like something alive trying to escape his skin. Michael had been drinking. Not much. Just a couple beers at a party, but enough. Enough that his blood alcohol was over the limit. Enough that he was looking at vehicular manslaughter, 10 years minimum. Reeve shifted beside Greta, understanding coming before she'd fully processed it. "Someone made it go away," Marcus's father, Tom confirmed. Old Malcolm Garrett still had connections even from prison. Made a phone call, greased the right palms, got the toxicology report altered. Suddenly Michael's blood alcohol was legal. Suddenly it was just a tragic accident, no criminal charges. My son got to go back to college, finish his degree, build a life. The girl's family got closure, but not justice. And I got a debt I could never repay. So when Marcus got out, he came collecting, Greta said. The pieces falling into place with sickening clarity. He gave me a choice. Tom finally looked up from the fire, and the anguish in his eyes was genuine. Help him find Reeve Calder, or he'd expose what really happened 5 years ago. My son would go to prison. My wife would know I'd helped cover up a death. Everything we'd built, everything we'd protected would collapse. You chose your family, Reeve said quietly. There was no judgment in his voice, just recognition of an impossible situation. I chose my family, Tom agreed. Over justice. Over my oath. Over the man I thought I was. I told myself it was just information, just helping Marcus track you through the witness protection system. I told myself I wasn't actually hurting anyone, just—" He stopped, shook his head. "The lies we tell ourselves to live with what we've done." Greta's rifle hadn't wavered, but her certainty had. She wanted to hate Tom Bridger, wanted to see him as purely evil, a betrayer who deserved no sympathy. But she understood impossible choices, understood guilt that ate away at everything you thought you were, understood the weight of protecting someone you loved at any cost. "You knew where I lived," she said. "Knew my habits. Knew I'd take in someone who needed help. I knew you better than you knew yourself," Tom said softly. "Knew that despite 20 years of isolation, despite every wall you'd built, you'd never walk past someone dying. It's who you are, who Samuel married, who I've been worried about all these years." He paused. "When Marcus said someone matching Reeve's description had been seen heading up the mountain, I knew exactly where he'd end up. So you led them to my cabin." I tried not to. Tried to convince Marcus that Reeve had frozen to death, that no one could survive that storm. But he didn't believe me. Said we'd check anyway, just to be sure. Tom's voice broke. "I'm sorry, Greta. I never wanted you involved in this. Never wanted to put you in danger. But by the time I realized you'd taken him in, it was too late to protect you. You could have warned me," Greta said. But even as the words left her mouth, she knew how hollow they were. "Warn her and expose his son. Warn her and lose everything he'd been trying to protect." "I could have," Tom agreed. "Should have. But I didn't, and now we're here and I have to decide if I'm going to keep being a coward or finally do the right thing." The right thing. Reeve spoke up, his voice sharp with betrayal that went deeper than anything Greta felt. "You've been feeding them information for 15 years. Every time I thought I was safe, every time I tried to build something like a life, you told them where to find me. How many times did I run because of you? How many close calls? How many people put at risk because you couldn't stand up to a dead criminal's blackmail?" "I know," Tom said, and the words sounded like a confession at an altar. "I know what I've done. Know what I am. Every relocation, every time they found you, I told myself it was the last time. But Marcus kept coming back, kept demanding more, and I kept giving it because I was too weak to face what I'd done 5 years ago. So what now?" Greta asked. "We're trapped in this cave. Marcus and his men are up there hunting us, and you're down here warming your hands by a fire. What happens next, Tom?" The sheriff reached into his jacket, slowly, carefully, letting them see he wasn't going for a weapon, and pulled out his badge. The 5-pointed star gleamed in the firelight, symbol of an oath he'd broken and an office he'd corrupted. He looked at it for a long moment, then set it on the ground beside the fire. "Now I stop being a coward," he said. "Now I tell you that Marcus has been playing both of us. He doesn't just want Reeve dead. He wants him to suffer first. Wants him to watch everyone who helped him die before he goes. That includes you, Greta. That includes anyone in the valley who showed you kindness. He's going to kill the whole valley?" Greta's voice dripped skepticism. "Not the whole valley, just the ones who matter. Virgil Hess at the store who provided you with supplies. Pauline DeWitt, who's been defending you to anyone who'll listen. Anyone who might have helped you or protected you. Marcus wants to make an example. Help a government witness die with the witness." Reeve's face had gone pale. "That's why he didn't just kill me 3 days ago. Why he left me in the storm instead of putting a bullet in my head. He wanted you to run," Tom confirmed. "Wanted to see where you'd go, who you'd turn to. Wanted to identify everyone in your network before he eliminated them all. The storm complicated things, but not enough. He knows you're at Greta's cabin. Knows she helped you. And now he's building a case for destroying everyone connected to this mountain." Greta's mind raced. Virgil, who'd been kind to her for 2 decades. Pauline, who'd been a friend when Greta barely remembered how to have friends. All the people in the valley who'd never done anything except show basic human decency. Marcus would kill them all to make his point, to extract his revenge. "We can't let that happen," she said. "No," Tom agreed. "We can't, which is why I'm going to help you get out of here. Help you get down the mountain. And then I'm going to turn myself in and tell the state police everything. About Marcus, about the Garretts, about what I've done. My son will face the consequences he should have faced 5 years ago. My family will know what I am. But maybe, if I do this right, I can stop Marcus before he hurts anyone else. You're going to sacrifice everything, Reeve said slowly. I already sacrificed everything, Tom replied. 5 years ago when I made the wrong choice. I've just been too much of a coward to face it until now. Until I saw what my cowardice was going to cost good people who don't deserve to die because of my weakness. Greta lowered the rifle, not because she trusted Tom Bridger, but because she believed him. Believed the anguish in his voice, the self-hatred in his eyes, the genuine desire for redemption, even if it destroyed him. She'd spent 20 years punishing herself for words she couldn't take back. She understood the need to finally do the right thing, even when it was too late to undo the wrong. How do we get out of here? She asked. Tom stood, moving to the cave wall where a map was pinned, hand-drawn, detailed, showing passages and chambers Greta had never known existed. There's another exit, he said. Natural chimney that comes out about 2 miles south of your cabin. It's a tight climb, dangerous even without injured people and armed pursuers, but it's a way out. I'll lead you there, then double back and delay Marcus as long as I can. That's suicide, Reeve said. Maybe, but it's also the first honest thing I'll have done in 5 years. Tom rolled up the map and handed it to Greta. Take this. If something happens to me, you'll need it to find your way. Greta took the map, feeling the weight of it like she was accepting Tom's guilt, his confession, his desperate bid for redemption. Why should we trust you? How do we know this isn't another trap? You don't, Tom said simply. You just have to decide if you believe I'm tired of being the villain in my own story. If you believe I loved Samuel enough to finally honor his memory by protecting his widow. If you believe that even a coward can find courage when there's nothing left to lose. Outside the chamber, echoing through stone passages, came the sound of voices. Marcus and his men, searching methodically, getting closer. Time for debate had run out. They either trusted Tom Bridger's 11th hour redemption, or they died in this cave trying to find another way. Greta met Reeve's eyes, saw her own uncertainty reflected back. Then she nodded. All right, we follow you. But if this is a trap, I promise you'll regret it. If this is a trap, Tom said quietly, I already regret everything. Come on, the chimney's this way, and we don't have much time. He moved toward the back of the chamber, where darkness swallowed the firelight. Greta and Reeve followed, weapons ready, trust given reluctantly but given nonetheless. Behind them the voices grew louder. Marcus was close now, and the endgame was approaching. One way or another, before the night ended, someone's story would reach its conclusion. Greta just hoped it wouldn't be hers. Tom led them through passages that seemed to exist in defiance of logic, twisting back on themselves, climbing when they should descend, narrowing, until Greta had to exhale completely to squeeze through gaps in the stone. His knowledge of these caves was comprehensive, intimate, born of weeks or months of exploration, while he'd waited for Marcus to make his move. How long have you been down here? Greta asked, as they climbed a natural staircase of broken rock. 3 days, Tom said. Marcus told me to establish an observation post, watch your cabin, report when Reeve showed up. I've been coming and going through the chimney using the caves as my base. Easier than trying to camp on the surface in this weather? And you were just going to let them kill us? Tom stopped climbing, his shoulders slumping. I told myself I'd warn you. Find a way to get you out before they moved in. But I'm a coward, Greta. I've proven that over and over. I kept waiting for the right moment, the perfect opportunity, and then you dragged Reeve inside, and the moment was gone. They continued climbing. Behind them, distant sounds of pursuit echoed through the stone. Marcus's team had found Tom's camp, would be following their trail soon. The chimney Tom was leading them toward better exist, better work, or they'd be trapped with nowhere left to run. Tell me about the chimney, Reeve said. His breathing labored from the climb and his injuries. How hard is it? Hard, Tom admitted. 60 feet of vertical climbing through a crack barely wide enough for a person. There are hand and footholds, but they're natural, not carved. Samuel and I climbed it once, years ago before he died. We talked about widening it, making it safer, but we never got around to it. You and Samuel explored these caves together, Greta said, the realization landing with unexpected weight. We did. Spent hours down here, mapping passages, talking about life, hiding from our wives when we needed space. Tom's voice carried old affection, mixed with newer grief. He was my best friend, only person I ever told about my fears for Michael, about being a father, and knowing you can't protect your kids from everything. When Michael killed that girl, Samuel was the first person I called. What did he say? He said I had to let Michael face the consequences. Said that loving someone meant letting them take responsibility for their actions, even when it destroyed them. Even when it destroyed you too, Tom's voice cracked. I didn't listen. Took the Garrett's help instead. And Samuel died never knowing I'd become the kind of man he'd have been ashamed to call friend. They reached a junction where 3 passages converged. Tom consulted the map by flashlight, making sure of their direction. Left, he said. Another 100 yards, then we start climbing. As they moved through the passage, Greta found herself studying Tom Bridger, really looking at him for the first time in years. He'd aged badly, she realized. Lines carved deep around his eyes and mouth, shoulders bent under weight that had nothing to do with the stone overhead. This was what guilt looked like when you carried it for years, when it ate away at everything you'd been and left only the hollow shell of who you'd wanted to be. She understood that intimately. I've been angry with you, she said as they walked. Angry that you kept checking on me, kept trying to be my friend when all I wanted was to be left alone. Angry that you wouldn't let me disappear the way I wanted to. I know, Tom said. You made it pretty clear I was wrong. About a lot of things. But mostly about thinking that isolation was the same as safety. That if I didn't let anyone close, I couldn't lose anyone else. She paused. These last 2 days with Reeve, fighting for something besides my own miserable survival, it's the most alive I've felt since Samuel died. Greta, I'm not saying I forgive you. Not sure I can, not after what you've done. But I understand why you did it. Understand the impossible choice between protecting the people you love and doing what's right. Understand how easy it is to convince yourself that just this once, just this one compromise, you can have both. Tom stopped walking and turned to face her, tears tracking through the dirt on his face. I'm sorry. For everything. For failing Samuel's memory. For putting you in danger? For being too weak to make the choice he would have made. We're all weak, Tom. We're all cowards about something. The question is what we do when we finally find the courage to face it. Behind them, flashlight beams found the passage entrance. Marcus's voice carried through the caves, amplified by acoustics. Sheriff, I know you're with them. Don't make this harder than it has to be. Here, Tom said, quickening his pace. The chimney's just ahead. They rounded a corner and found it, a vertical crack in the ceiling, narrow and dark, disappearing upward into blackness. Tom shined his light up, showing rough stone walls close enough to touch on both sides, occasional ledges that might serve as rest points. It looked impossible. It looked like a death trap. You're sure this comes out on the surface? Reeve asked, doubt heavy in his voice. I've climbed it twice, Tom confirmed. It opens onto a rock shelf about 2 miles south of Greta's cabin. From there you can work your way down to the valley roads. Storm's breaking. You should be able to get help by morning. Should, Greta repeated. That's a hell of a word to bet our lives on. It's the only word I've got left. Tom pulled a coil of rope from his pack, started rigging it through pitons he'd apparently placed during previous climbs. I'll go first. Set the rope for you to follow. Reeve goes second. He'll need the most help. Greta, you bring up the rear. Use the rope when you need it, but trust the stone. It's held for 10,000 years. It'll hold one more night. What about you? Reeve asked. After you get us to the top? I go back down. Find Marcus. Delay him as long as I can, while you get clear. Tom finished his rigging and tested the rope. I'll tell him you went deeper into the caves. Send him the wrong way. By the time he realizes I lied, you'll be far enough away to reach help. That's suicide, Greta said flatly. Marcus will kill you the second he realizes you betrayed him. Probably. Tom met her eyes, and for the first time in 5 years, She saw something like peace in his expression. But I'll die doing the right thing. That's more than I've managed in a long time. Flashlight beams were getting closer, voices echoing with renewed urgency. Marcus knew they were cornered, knew the end game was here. Tom started climbing, moving with surprising agility for a man in his 60s, using the rope only occasionally as he scaled the narrow chimney. Greta watched him ascend, disappearing into darkness overhead. Reeve checked his revolvers, his face grim. "If this doesn't work, it'll work," Greta interrupted. "It has to. But if it doesn't, I want you to know—" He stopped, struggling with words. "These 2 days being here with you, remembering what it feels like to connect with another person, it's been worth everything. Worth getting beaten, worth running. Worth dying if that's what comes next." Greta felt something crack in her chest, some wall she'd built that couldn't hold against genuine emotion honestly expressed. "Don't talk like that. We're both getting out of here. We're both going to live long enough to figure out what comes after survival." From above, Tom's voice. "Ropes secure! Reeve, start climbing!" Reeve moved to the chimney, testing the rope, finding the first handholds. His injured body protested every movement, but he climbed steadily, using the rope when strength failed, trusting the stone when strength held. Greta watched him ascend, rifle ready, covering their retreat against the approaching pursuit. Marcus's team rounded the corner just as Reeve was 15 feet up. 3 men, Marcus in front, 2 others flanking him. All armed, all focused, all done with patience and games. "End of the line," Marcus said, his voice cold and final. "Come down from there, Calder. Let's finish what we started 3 days ago." "Go to hell!" Reeve called back, continuing to climb. Marcus raised his rifle, aiming up the chimney. Greta didn't think. She fired first, her shot deliberate and controlled, taking Marcus in the shoulder. He spun with the impact, his own shot going wide, hitting stone instead of flesh. His men returned fire, forcing Greta behind cover, bullets sparking off rock where she'd been standing. "Greta, climb!" Tom's voice from above, urgent and commanding. "I'm coming down." "No," Greta shouted back. "Stay up there. Get Reeve out." But Tom was already descending, rappelling down the rope with practiced speed. He dropped beside Greta, his service weapon drawn. "You don't die here. Not for me, not for my mistakes. Tom, I mean it." He met her eyes, and she saw Samuel in that look, the same stubborn determination, the same willingness to stand between people he loved and danger. "You and Reeve climb. I'll hold them here." Marcus had recovered from the shoulder wound, was advancing with his men in a coordinated pattern. They had superior numbers, superior position. This wasn't a fight Tom could win. He'd die here in these caves alone, buying time measured in minutes at best, but those minutes might be enough. "Thank you," Greta said, loading those 2 words with everything she couldn't say: forgiveness for betrayal, understanding for impossible choices, recognition that courage could come late but still matter. Samuel would have been proud. "No, he wouldn't," Tom said, but there was something like hope in his voice. But maybe he'd understand. Greta started climbing. The stone was rough under her hands, the rope secure but thin. Above her, she could hear Reeve's labored breathing as he climbed, could see the faint light that meant Tom's flashlight was still ascending. Below her, gunfire erupted, Tom's last stand against the men who turned him into a traitor and were about to make him a martyr. She climbed faster, ignoring the burn in her shoulders, the ache in her fingers. The chimney seemed endless, each foot gained revealing only more stone above, more darkness to conquer. But she kept moving, kept reaching, kept trusting that somewhere above there was sky and air, and something like freedom. 30 feet up, she heard Tom cry out. Pain or defiance, she couldn't tell which. More gunfire, then silence. Then Marcus's voice, distant now but still carrying. "He's down. Find the others. Don't let them reach the surface." Tom was dead or dying. Either way, his sacrifice would be meaningless if she and Reeve didn't make it out. Greta climbed like she had demons at her heels, which in a very real sense she did. The last 20 feet of the chimney were the hardest. Greta's arms screamed with exhaustion. Her fingers could barely grip the stone, and every breath felt like fire in her lungs. But above her, she could see something new, not more darkness, but the slightly lighter darkness of night sky. The storm had broken. The way out was real. Reeve had already made it to the top, was leaning down to help her over the final ledge. His hands locked around her wrists, and together they hauled her out of the chimney onto a snow-covered rock shelf. For a moment, they just lay there, gulping cold air, letting their bodies remember they were still alive. Then Greta forced herself up, scanning their surroundings. The shelf was exposed, wind-scoured, with a gradual slope leading down toward the tree line, about 50 yards away. Beyond that, she could see the valley spreading below, lights from distant houses like scattered stars. Civilization, help, survival. "Can you walk?" she asked Reeve. He pulled himself upright, testing his legs. "I can do what I have to. Then we move. Fast as you can manage. Get to the trees, work our way down to the valley road." They started down the slope, feet sinking in fresh snow, bodies protesting every step. Behind them, Greta could hear sounds from the chimney, Marcus's men starting the climb. Tom had bought them maybe 10 minutes. 10 minutes to get far enough ahead that pursuit became impossible in the dark. They reached the tree line and plunged into the forest. Here the snow was lighter, blocked by the canopy, and travel was easier. Greta led by instinct and memory, following game trails she'd walked during her guiding years, always heading downward, always moving towards safety. But exhaustion was catching up with both of them. Reeve's pace slowed to barely more than a stumble, his breathing ragged and wrong. Greta's own vision was starting to blur at the edges, adrenaline finally wearing off and leaving only the bone-deep fatigue of 2 days without real rest. Behind them, flashlight beams cut through the darkness. Marcus's men had reached the surface, were following their trail through the snow. Fresh footprints leading through the forest, impossible to hide, impossible to deny. "We're not going to make it," Reeve said, his voice flat with acceptance. "Not both of us." "Don't start that. Greta, be realistic." "I can barely walk. You're carrying me more than I'm walking on my own. Every minute you stay with me is a minute Marcus gets closer. I'm not leaving you. You have to." He stopped, leaning against a tree, his face gray in the moonlight filtering through clouds. "I'll find a place to hide, lead them away from you. You get to the valley, get help. Come back with the state police and arrest whatever's left of Marcus's operation." "That's insane." "He'll kill you." "Probably. But at least one of us will survive. At least Tom's sacrifice won't be for nothing." Reeve managed something like a smile. "Besides, I've been running for 15 years. I'm tired, Greta, so tired of being afraid, of looking over my shoulder, of surviving without living. If this is where it ends, at least it ends with me standing still, making a choice instead of just reacting. You can make that choice after we both get out of here. There isn't time for both." He pushed off from the tree, wobbled, caught himself. "Please let me do this. Let me protect someone for once, instead of being the reason people die." Greta wanted to argue, wanted to refuse, wanted to drag him bodily down the mountain, if that's what it took. But she could see in his eyes that he'd already made his decision. Could see the peace that came with finally stopping the running, finally turning to face what chased him. And she understood it, had felt it herself when she'd opened her door to a dying stranger. Sometimes the bravest thing was standing still. "Where?" she asked quietly. "There." Reeve pointed to an outcropping of rock about 30 yards off their path. "Natural fortress. Good sight lines. I can hold them there, buy you the time you need." Greta felt tears on her face, cold in the mountain air. "This isn't fair. We just found each other." "I know, but maybe that's enough. Maybe 2 days of feeling alive is worth more than 15 years of just existing." He reached into his shirt and pulled out the photograph of Rachel, the one marked with apologies and old love. "Make sure someone knows what happened. Tell them I stopped running. Tell them I stood for something." He pressed the photograph into her hands, then leaned forward and kissed her forehead. Brief, gentle goodbye. "Go, Greta, run, and when you get clear, start living. For both of us. Reeve, go." She went. Not because she wanted to, not because it felt right, but because he'd asked her, and she couldn't deny him this final choice. She ran down the mountain, tears freezing on her face. his photograph clutched in her hand, the sounds of pursuit fading behind her, and behind her, Reeve Calder found his rock fortress, checked his revolvers one last time, and settled in to make his last stand count for something. The flashlight beams found him minutes later. Greta ran until her lungs burned and her legs gave out, until she collapsed in the snow and couldn't force herself back up. Only then did she let herself look back up the mountain. She couldn't see the outcropping from here, couldn't see Reeve's last stand, but she could hear it. The crack of gunfire echoing through the forest, deliberate shots spaced with terrible patience. Each shot felt like it was hitting her instead of stone or flesh. Each silence between made her wonder if Reeve was dead, if it was over, if his sacrifice had bought her enough time, or if Marcus would come for her next. She forced herself up, made her legs work despite their protests. If Reeve was buying her time with his life, she couldn't waste it lying in the snow, feeling sorry for herself. She stumbled forward, using trees for support, following the slope downward. The valley road had to be close now. Had to be. The gunfire behind her intensified, multiple weapons, a pitched battle. Reeve was still fighting, still alive. The knowledge gave her strength she didn't know she had left. She pushed harder, faster, ignoring pain and exhaustion. Then she heard engines. Multiple vehicles coming up the mountain road. For a moment, terror seized her. More of Marcus's people, reinforcements called in to finish the job. But as they got closer, she saw red and blue lights flashing through the trees. Police vehicles. Help. Greta stumbled out of the forest onto the road just as 3 state police cruisers rounded the bend. They stopped hard, doors flying open, officers emerging with weapons drawn. A woman in a sheriff's department uniform stepped forward, and Greta recognized her, Deputy Lyons, one of Tom's subordinates. Mrs. Lorne. The deputy's weapon lowered, shock clear on her face. What happened? Where's Sheriff Bridger? Dead, Greta gasped out. In the caves. He died protecting us. Marcus Garrett and his men. They're up there trying to kill a federal witness. You have to help him. Have to stop them. How many men? 3, maybe 2 if the sheriff got one. Greta grabbed the deputy's arm. Please, he's alone up there. He won't last much longer. Deputy Lyons was already on her radio, calling for backup, coordinating the response. Another cruiser appeared, then 2 more. Within minutes, there were 8 armed officers ready to move. The deputy assigned 2 to stay with Greta, then led the rest up the mountain at a run. Greta sagged against one of the cruisers, letting the officers wrap her in a blanket, press water into her hands. She could still hear gunfire from above, but now it was joined by new sounds. Police sirens shouted orders. The organized chaos of law enforcement converging on Marcus's position. "Ma'am," one of the officers said gently, "we need to get you to a hospital. You're hypothermic, exhausted. Not until I know he's safe. Not until they bring him down." The officer didn't argue, just stayed beside her, monitoring her vitals, making sure she didn't collapse. Time stretched. The gunfire above had stopped. Whether that meant victory or tragedy, Greta couldn't know. She held Reeve's photograph like a talisman, Rachel's face staring up at her in the cruiser's dome light. Then movement on the trail. Officers emerging from the forest, supporting a figure between them. Greta's heart stopped, restarted, stopped again. She couldn't see faces in the darkness, couldn't tell if it was Reeve or a body or... "Greta!" Reeve's voice weak but alive. Greta pushed past the officers trying to restrain her, running up the trail to meet them. He looked worse than before, new wounds, fresh blood, barely conscious, but his eyes found hers, and something like relief crossed his face. "You made it," he said as they reached each other. "I heard the sirens, knew you'd gotten through." "You stupid, brave idiot," Greta said, tears flowing freely now. "You could have died." "I was fine with dying," Reeve said. "But apparently Marcus's men weren't fine with becoming cop killers. When they heard the police coming, they ran. Left me there, bleeding but breathing." "Marcus?" Deputy Lyons had appeared beside them. "In custody. His men, too. We got all 3 before they could reach the valley road." "It's over, Mrs. Lorne. They're done. Over." The word seemed impossible. 2 days ago, Greta had been alone in her cabin, frozen at 3:47, waiting for time to end. Now she stood on a mountain road, covered in blood and dirt and tears, with a man she barely knew, but had risked everything to save. The paramedics were loading Reeve into an ambulance. He reached for her hand, held tight. "Come with me. Don't want to face hospitals alone." "I'll be right there," Greta promised. "Just need to do one thing first." She walked to where Deputy Lyons was supervising the arrests. Marcus was handcuffed, his shoulder bandaged from Greta's earlier shot, his face twisted with fury and defeat. When he saw her approaching, he spat at her feet. "Should have let him die in the snow," Marcus said. "Should have minded your own business." Greta looked at him, this man who'd terrorized Reeve for 15 years, who'd corrupted Tom Bridger, who'd nearly destroyed everything and everyone he touched. And she felt nothing but pity. "No," she said quietly. "I did exactly what I should have done. I chose to help someone who needed it. I chose to be alive instead of just existing. And because of that choice, you're going to prison and he's going to live. I'd call that a pretty good night's work." She turned her back on Marcus Garrett and walked to the ambulance where Reeve was waiting. Where life, real life, messy and complicated and worth living, was waiting. The photograph of Rachel stayed in her pocket, a promise kept and a burden shared. Together, she and Reeve would figure out what came next. Together, they'd learn to live instead of just survive. The ambulance pulled away, lights flashing, heading toward the valley and whatever future awaited them. Behind them, the mountain stood silent, keeping its secrets, holding its dead. Tom Bridger had found his redemption in those caves. Samuel's memory had been honored, and Greta Lorne had finally, after 20 frozen years, let time start moving again. 6 months later, spring had come to the Bitterroot Range. Greta stood on what used to be the foundation of her old cabin, watching Virgil Hess and 3 men from the valley frame the walls of her new home. The structure rising from the ashes was different from what had burned, larger, with windows that faced the valley instead of turning away from it. A porch built for sitting with visitors rather than defending against the world. "Looking good," Reeve said, appearing at her elbow with 2 cups of coffee. He moved with a slight limp now, souvenir of that night in the mountains, but the haunted look in his eyes had faded. 6 months of being able to stop running had done wonders for a man who'd spent 15 years looking over his shoulder. "It's bigger than I need," Greta said, accepting the coffee. "Good thing you're not living alone anymore." Then, they'd had this conversation before in the hospital after that first night. Then again, in the weeks that followed, as they'd given statements to investigators and testified in Marcus Garrett's trial. The conversation about what came next, about whether 2 broken people could build something whole together, about whether friendship forged in crisis could survive in peacetime. The answer, it seemed, was yes. With work, with patience, with the understanding that healing wasn't linear and some wounds never fully closed. Reeve had officially ended his witness protection status. With Marcus and his organization dismantled, the federal prosecutors agreed there was no longer a credible threat. He'd settled in Bitterroot Valley under his real name, taken a job at a local ranch teaching horsemanship to troubled teenagers. Greta had watched him with those kids, seen how he connected with their anger and fear and directionlessness, seen how saving them was helping save himself. She'd started guiding again, small groups, nothing too ambitious, but enough to remember why she'd loved it in the first place. The mountains had always been her home. She'd just forgotten that home was meant to be shared, not hoarded in isolation. "I heard from Michael Bridger," Greta said, watching the construction. "Tom's son. He started his prison sentence last month. How's he doing?" "Better than expected. Says he finally told his mother everything, about the accident, about what his father did to protect him, about the cost of that protection. She's standing by him, visiting every week. Tom's death had been the hardest part of the aftermath. His confession had become public record through the trial, his betrayals exposed alongside his final act of redemption. The valley had struggled with it, their sheriff, their protector, revealed as corrupt and compromised. But Greta had spoken at his memorial service, told them about his last hours, about the courage it took to finally choose right over easy. He died trying to fix his mistakes, she'd said to the assembled mourners. That's more than most of us manage. He deserves to be remembered for his redemption, not just his failures. It hadn't been a popular position at first, but time had softened some of the anger. A bench had been dedicated in Tom's memory, engraved with his badge number and the dates of his service. It didn't erase what he'd done, but it acknowledged that people were complicated, that heroes could fail and cowards could find courage. Virgil called out from the construction site, asking about window placement. Greta walked over to consult, Reeve following. This had become their routine. Mornings at the build site, afternoons at their temporary housing in the valley, evenings spent planning the future or remembering the past. It was domestic and ordinary, and nothing like the isolation Greta had maintained for 20 years. It was also the happiest she'd been since Samuel died. "You know what today is?" Reeve asked, as they watched the workers secure a beam. Greta glanced at her watch, the new one Reeve had given her 3 months ago. Silver and simple, engraved on the back with, "For all the moments ahead." Samuel's stopped watch sat on her bedside table now. Honored but not controlling, a memory rather than a prison. "June 5th, she said. "Why?" 6 months since we met. Since you opened your door in a blizzard and changed everything? Changed everything for both of us. For both of us, Reeve agreed. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the photograph of Rachel, worn even softer now from months of carrying. "I've been thinking about this. About her. About what she'd want for me. And I think she'd want me to let go. Not forget, I'll never forget, but let go of the guilt, the constant apology, the idea that I owe her my misery." He held the photograph out to Greta. "I thought maybe we could add it to the memory wall. You know, the one we talked about for the new cabin. Rachel and Samuel both. The people who shaped us, who we loved and lost. Give them a place of honor without letting them stop us from moving forward." Greta took the photograph, studying Rachel's face. She'd never met this woman, but she felt connected to her through Reeve's memories, through the shared experience of loss and guilt and gradual healing. "I think that's perfect." Samuel would have liked Rachel. They were both married to stubborn people who didn't know when to quit. Takes one to know one. The construction continued around them, the sound of hammers and saws composing a symphony of renewal. Pauline DeWitt had interviewed them both for her documentary, an expanded version now that included Tom's story and Marcus's trial. It had won awards, been picked up by national streaming services. Their story had become public in ways Greta never could have imagined 6 months ago, but the attention was fading now, and what remained was just life. "Real, complicated, beautiful life, I was thinking," Reeve said as they walked back toward their observation point. "Maybe when the cabin's done, we throw a party. Invite the whole valley. Show them what their help built. Thank them for taking in a stranger and giving him a home." "Sounds terrifying," Greta said. "Absolutely terrifying. Let's do it." They stood together on the foundation of the future, watching the past take shape as something new. The mountain rose behind them, eternal and indifferent. The valley spread below, warm and welcoming. And somewhere between those two extremes, two people who'd been frozen by guilt and fear were learning to live in the present tense. Greta thought about the woman she'd been 6 months ago, isolated, bitter, waiting for time to end. She thought about opening her door to find a dying man in the snow. About the choice she'd made without fully understanding what it would cost or what it would give her. She thought about Samuel's last words to her, written in a letter she'd carried for 20 years without reading. "You're the bravest person I know. Forgive me. More importantly, forgive yourself." It had taken her 2 decades to open that letter. Another 6 months to begin taking its advice. But standing here now, with Reeve beside her and a home rising from the ashes and a future that looked nothing like her past, she thought maybe she was finally getting there. "You okay?" Reeve asked, noticing her expression. "Better than okay," Greta said, and meant it. "For the first time in 20 years, I'm actually okay." The hammering continued. The cabin took shape, and time, which had been stopped at 3:47 for longer than Greta cared to remember, moved forward into whatever came next. It was enough. More than enough, it was everything.